I made notes, but I'll put them down because I think that depreciates. Because actually, if I wasn't interested, I wouldn't. If I mean, the notes when you haven't actually watched it or haven't actually engaged with it. I mean, you raised so many things. There's actually there's two perspectives here. There's two ramifications to this work. Obviously, the original operatic work itself, then the film covering that, and the various strands, and then your film actually it covers the questions raised by the opera, and raises your own questions in that tripartite dialogue, that you had. I mean, that's a masterpiece. And this is in such a simple format. No fireworks, no glitz, just hard brass tacks intellectualism. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. My first question. I'm sorry, guys. I mean, these questions are for me. Or if you want yours, I'll give you a chance afterwards. I'm just going to have some fun now. Yeah. My first question really is about because I know you've done quite a bit of work in cultural history, surrounding the theater and film and cinema and so on and so forth. But I'm looking at operatic traditions because the dialogue there obviously it explores the intersection between the European operatic traditions and African operatic traditions. But then what has been done both by the original opera and indeed by this film is actually to explore quite cleverly the Sahelian operatic traditions, which, as obviously by your African origins in Guinea, there is an established, from the griots and even the vocal traditions. Now, I will now drag you away from that comfort zone and look at West Africa, because the question is, does that same culture, that same African operatic culture, is it duplicated in West Africa? Because I know of Adam Faber-Asima's work, Opujaja, and a few others like that, but it seemed as if for this Sahelian sub-region, it was easier to create an operatic tradition. Would that be a correct statement, or do you have a different perspective on that?
Thank you very much for your kind words. I really appreciate it. Actually, I was just talking to Goma and yes, and that question came up, and I was actually sending the question back to Nigeria, because when you remember in Nigeria with people like Wole Soyinka, Osofi San, and plays like Opera Onyosi, the Ojidi Saga, I don't know if you remember those. So I actually thought that the opera tradition, because of the development of theater and music, and particularly I was saying something very stereotypical, but forgive me, I said, and also Yoruba gesture and costumes and their relation to each other, that opera would be more natural in Nigeria than Mali. Yeah. So I was answering your question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So
brilliant.
Forgive me if I'm too stereotypical about this.
Yeah.
But yes, it's Sahelian. We do have the griotic tradition.
Yes.
The griotic tradition, which basically does everything in poetry and in song.
Yes.
In song, and therefore define heroes, define tragedies through music and through poetry, yes. The bardic tradition. But honestly, we were talking about this.
Yes.
Ugoma just 2 minutes ago, yeah. I said Nigeria probably is more appropriate for this, but, okay. So it's ironic.
Okay, indeed. I mean, I'm going to attempt to answer the question, because obviously I think it's a question that we should actually explore in a bit more detail. But I will move on to the next point. I will just raise something you raised about in terms of Yoruba dance traditions, Yoruba vocal traditions. But I mean, the Bata dance is like a lot of the dance, because the operatic delivery we saw actually involved quite a bit of dance, which is not necessarily so typical of the European style. But then Bata dance traditions are very, very much mirror what we saw there, without the vocal element. But then there are other, because obviously in Nigerian culture, Nigeria is a very complex place, 350 ethnic groups. Sometimes even within ethnic groups, there are several subcultures, and even artistic cultures and artistic strands, which make it any attempt to provide a stock answer is pure, it would be self-deceit.
Well, I'll give you one example.
Yes.
I was in Ilorin maybe about 5-6 years ago.
Yes.
And I was with Abdul Rashid, Nala,
Yes, yeah.
who teaches at the university, was a chancellor.
Yeah.
And we went to see his mother.
Yes.
And he and his mother started this salutation, greeting. It went on for 5 minutes. I was so jealous. You know, they will kneel down, they go down, they do like this.
Yeah, oku,
And
oku.
I mean, we don't do that in Mali anymore. I was so jealous. And that's his mother. That relation was so beautiful. That was in Ilorin. And so it's not, you know, my first instinct was, well, maybe because of Islam in my area, we don't do this anymore. But Ilorin is the capital of Islam, so it's not Islam at all. I was really jealous. I mean, the gestures, the movement, it was like peacocks and all kind of birds really encountering. It was just so beautiful. You know? But anyway, I digress a lot.
Indeed. My next question really is more about, obviously, the musical elements, because the classical, you know, obviously classical traditions are at the base of the operatic movements. Now, I'm going to throw the cat among the pigeons and raise a controversial subject, which Aduke over there is quite familiar with. A good friend of ours, Tony Jagede, has done quite a bit of work in exploring the classical traditions of the music of the courts of Mali in particular. Now, obviously, his thesis being that the classical traditions predated that of Europe. I'm not going to say yes or no. All we can talk about is that the fact that at least there's a chronological basis for stating that the Malian, the Sahelian classical tradition dated from the 13th century with the use of polyphonic instruments. Now, it comes back again to that question about the Sahelian tradition, because its natural affinity to the European operatic model. Would that equally be a correct statement or otherwise?
Yeah, you know, in many ways, you said 13th century, but if you look at the Ghana Empire, which is also in that Sahel region, you know, Mauritania, Mali, that area of Ouagadougou, in many ways, you have this moment when they used to always, this is from the griotic tradition again, you know, I'm not a historian, but if you look at the history of the Ghana Empire, you have a woman called Sira.
Yes.
And the king used to always sacrifice the most beautiful woman to the king's twin brother, who was a snake in a well.
Yes.
Until Mamadou Camelon, and his name is very symbolic, and he fell in love with Sira, and then he said there is no way his fiancée is going to be sacrificed to a monster in a well.
Yes.
So he cut the 7 heads off. By the way, in Western tradition, if you want to read about this, both Leo Frobenius wrote about it, but Ezra Pound also has translated Leo Frobenius. And the story, they call it Gassire's lute. But the point I'm trying to make is that the 7 heads of the snake went in different places, but each one of them cursed us. That's my tribe, if you want to talk about tribe or ethnic, that we will be destined to exile, we'll be destined to poverty, all our gold will go out, all these things, you know. I'm sure you have something similar in Nigeria.
Yeah, we usually say return to sender.
Okay, so the griotic tradition is there and is very close to this classical tradition of the opera that you're talking about. But the difference is that in the West, and we try to bring this up in the film, the opera now is in a sacred temple.
Yes.
And Alexander Klug, who really helped me with the film, basically made this point that the form of the opera cannot be changed, but he can play with the elements. The elements in the opera, you can play with them. And as you play with them, that's how you eventually can bring in something as mundane as immigration, but you can really bring in whatever it is, the 6th century Ghana or the Nigerian stories that you mentioned and so on. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, because I think he made mention of the fact that the themes the plebeian sources,
That's right.
could, they're legitimate, but then obviously the platform of expression will always be elitist.
That's right.
And if you think about the court music, the classical court music we talked about in Mali, it was elitist. It was the music of the court. So the intersect is also there. I go to my last question, which deals with the other strand that has been quite extensively dealt with here, the intersection of migration, the universality of migration, which is very, and I loved your last line, which is, well, all said and done, we can raise all the hue and cry about the negative perceptions, the growing xenophobia, and growing closed-mindedness, but then the fact is that you are a case study for the fact that the openness, for the continuing openness, be it in silos or otherwise, of Europe. But then I just want to raise, because obviously the symbiotic or continuum of migration is something that I have actually done quite a bit of, been considering for quite recently. Interestingly enough, the Levantine migration of the 19th century and early 20th century, in which lots of Levantines escaping persecution traveled down, to many of them to Africa, seeking refuge in Africa. I mean, the first Lebanese trader settled here in 1885. And you think about the fact that we're back again in the 21st century, we're seeing persons, not necessarily of the Levantines, but from Syria escaping persecution. And meanwhile, there was a time when there was that cross-migration from Europe. I mean, this is more a comment than anything else. I mean, is this what, obviously something you covered in quite a bit of detail here, but then do you have any further thoughts that you would want to expand on, apart from what you've already raised in the documentary?
Thank you for actually bringing that question. What was very important to me, I was invited in 2007 to Mali to be at the premiere of the Sahel Opera. So I was invited by the Prince Claus Foundation. I said, well, I will come, but I have to film it. So I went a little bit ahead of time, filmed the rehearsals, and I had all my prejudices. Oh, these Europeans doing operas in Africa again. So I wanted to film the whole thing. So I went 7 days, filmed everything. And then, so that's the images. The images you saw in the film are basically the images that I filmed in outdoor staged opera on the Niger River in Bamako, So I filmed that, and I put it away. And the idea was they kept asking me, well, could you just make a little film on the making of the opera? But I was not interested in documentary on the opera. So in 2015, they saw my film, actually, which is also Nigerian, because it's a film called Negritude, a dialogue between Soyinka and Senghor. So they saw that. They said, well, could we show this in the next documentary? I said, no. I mean, I'm 64 years old. You want me to put my film away until documentary opens? No way. But if you give me money, I make another film. So that's how this film came up. And they say, okay, do a project. So I went to my archives, and then I looked at things and I realized that if we keep talking about just African immigration, we are now really looking at the world. That immigration is a war, from the beginning of the world. Persecutions, wars, that's why you have that long, boring writing at the beginning, of the film, that human beings have been moving since the beginning. So that's why I went from Bintu Wore, which was personal, African opera, which was Africa, to an opera of the world. Because this is really, I can't think of any one culture that at some point, or any one country that at some point did not know immigration because of one reason or another. So I wanted the film to look at that, to put it in that broader context, because the immediate problem for me is that Trump is building a wall. So I wanted to address the question of the wall. So that was the immediate problem. Another problem is, I'm Francophone, and Marine Le Pen almost became president of France. These were the kind of things that were in my mind when I edited the film in Greece. So I wanted to address immigration in larger context, but also address the question of hospitality. Because the majority of European support hospitality. You know, even if they're worried about the economic situation. Sometime in the US, for example, African migrant and Hispanic people are the first one who rise against immigrants. We don't want them here. And they forget that they themselves had just arrived. So that brings up for me serious questions of guilt, because I left Bamako, went to Paris without a visa, just a laissez-passer. That's how I went to Paris. And I went to the US Embassy, and I said, I want to go to America and study. You know, this was 1972. And the guy said, who's going to support you in the US? I said, my father. He stamped my passport, and I went to America. So I come from that generation, and now people are dying. Yes. So that is a tremendous moment, area of guilt for me. So I had to address these kind of issues. That's why I made it very, very large. I think you're right about the Lebanese immigration here. Syrians also, yeah. They used to come here at some point, or in Latin America or other places. But my Jewish colleagues, when they saw the film in Amsterdam, but also in Keazor in Germany and Athens, they said, this is my story. And I really wanted to do something like that. And then the final thing I want to add to that is this. I'm more, anybody, I think you are too, you may be a bit younger, but you are too. But anybody trained in our generation, we were trained with Fanon, with the Soenkas and the Osofis, and they taught us Brechtian tradition. You had to have distance, no emotion. Now, I had to learn how to bring emotion in the film, literally. That's not me. I mean, you can read all my work, my books, my films. You don't want to do emotion. You always want to do something reflexive. There is some of that in this film. I keep taking time, bringing commentaries in order to break the emotion. But I had to work hard to see how you bring emotion. We were not trained like that. We were trained to really distance, take a distance, look at something, analyze it, and tell people what it means. So you beat them in the head. But don't do emotions at all. And I have to learn that all over. And the German guy was very good in doing that. You know, Alexander Krug, he's amazing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for you now. I've had my fun, so you can ask 2 questions.
Prof, thank you very much. Great music, interesting performance. I can see why you chose that particular work to tell your story. I also do notice that you are using some terms, lumpen, you know, that sort of thing. And you know, now that you tell us your age, that you're 64, I understand that part of your generation. See, okay, yes, okay. Part of your generation, you started as Marxian scholars.
Yes.
And you know, how much of that is reflected in this kind of work that you do? And whereas one understands where you're coming from, about, you know, your willingness that migration should be, I get a sense that you didn't try to pay attention to that other side that worries about the siege, I mean the siege of Europe as it is by the other. I don't know whether you, perhaps because of your own history, but you know, I kept on thinking that you might have dropped in somewhere along the line, you know, that this, I mean, there has to be this consciousness, because when that terrorism happens, it is usually that kind of person that is responsible. But great work, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I think the last point, you have a very good point. You raised a very good point. There is, I mean, there is serious fear in Europe. It's not just politicians instrumentalizing immigration, but you have good people who are afraid in Europe, and you have to you have to really work to make those good people more comfortable in the way they perceive of hospitality. People are leaving Africa because African presidents, African governments actually want them to leave. They're not saying this, but they want to get rid of them. Or because Europe actually, after doing what they did to Africa, suddenly they're closing the door. And yet they keep exploiting Africa. They don't want to get into those kind of discussions. I think, yeah.
Thank you very much. So, okay, I think we've got the lot. Okay, got a question?
Evening. Mine is just a really quick question. I was interested with the music in the opera because Malian music, especially that from Wasalu, is supposed to be the beginning of the hip hop, the jazz, the blues. So I thought it was interesting. So I wanted to ask you, was that intentional as well? Because it's like a reverse immigration, because the music is now coming back to where it started from.
Okay, so there are several qualifications I have to make. On the one hand, the opera, the Prince Class Foundation in Netherlands, they produced the original opera. So they had people from Senegal, Mali, Niger, all the Sahel region, as you were saying, to do the opera. Predominantly the music is Malian, the griotic tradition, traditional griotic tradition. And it was composed by a Senegalese artist that some of you know, he's very famous, Waziz Diop. And Waziz Diop is, for people who are in the film world, is the brother of Djibril Diop Mambeti, who made Tuki Tuki, Hyena, all those great films in African cinema. So Waziz really has one foot in Africa, one foot in the West. He's an ethnomusicologist and a very good musician himself. So having said all of that, to answer your question, what do you see, that the Malian music that you saw there, and I deliberately ended the music, the film, with a song that my mother used to listen to, that last song. And that's the most ambiguous song, because when I was growing up, I thought it was, because my mother loved the song so much, and the song basically saying, if you lean on a tree, when the tree dies, what are you gonna do? If you lean on a river, the river dries, what are you gonna do? And then if you lean on a person, the person dies, what are you gonna do? Therefore, lean on something that is gonna be permanent. So this song has been, I just realized this in Greece when I was editing the film. So there is one tradition that's Islamic. Lean on God, because God is permanent. So you have that tradition more or less around 1967 and so on. 50s, it was to lean on your best friend and your lover. And then later on, the lean on just become leaning on the immigrant, because he can go and bring money. The same song, same words, but how they sang were having meanings like that. So that kind of operatic songs are more associated with women in the griot traditions of the Sahel. You know, women sing like that. There are few men like the Gesere in my area who will sing, but otherwise the men talk. So hip hop education, they talk, they do declamations, and then they play music. But the woman, still today, if you listen to people like Tumani Jabate, you could hear women singing, or many people like that. So in a way, I wanted to, well, it wasn't me actually. I was just a lucky man, because I was invited to the opera, and I was invited by Documenta in Germany. So I wanted to put something together that would bring what you saw here. Yeah. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I guess that's the last of our questions. Please join me in giving a very well-deserved applause. He's traveled very far to share an incredible piece of work with us. And